Hello my dear friends, how is it going? I'm Draugr and today I'm going to talk about the funeral scene we see in the Northman movie, the ritualistic funeral performance to the character Þórir, son of Fjolnir. On the previous video I've talked about the rituals, cults and symbols we can find depicted in the movie The Northman, and because that video was almost 2 hours long, I have decided to cut on some themes and perhaps cover them on other videos, which is exactly what I'm going to do today. You have shown curiosity concerning the funeral scene in that movie, and here I am to talk about it. One curious thing, actually, before I forget, because I forgot to mention it in the previous video, which is the name of Fjolnir itself. As we see in the movie, Fjolnir is devoted to the god Freyr, and we get to see some iconography and ritual performances towards that deity. Curiously, the very name Fjolnir is indeed linked to the god Freyr. In fact, in Grimnismal, Odin, the god Odin, announces a long list of his names, and Fjolnir appears as one of his names. And in the poem Rignismal, a man standing on the mountain, clearly Odin, uses this same name, Fjolnir, to refer to himself. But this is because Odin indeed became quite the popular deity among the Scandinavian elite, and so incorporated several names and attributes of other deities in an attempt to consolidate several cults and belief systems and reinforce the power and control of the Scandinavian elite over the many subjects who had several belief systems. However, there's a tradition about Fjolnir, which we can read a considerable detailed part of it still in Snorre's Ynglinga saga, from which the director of the Northman movie also drawn inspiration from. In this account, Fjolnir is the son of the god Freyr, king and deity of the Swedes in Uppsala. So I thought I would point this out to show you yet again these little things that show a great attention to detail in the making of this movie, The Northman. But, sorry, let us move on to the main subject of this video. In this act, the funeral, we finally began to see Amleth taking his revenge, taking the lives of those he finds in front of him with his magic sword, acquired after the fight with the Guardian of a Mount. Sorry, there was another detail that I wanted to talk about, and I've remembered it just now, because some of you asked me why Amleth placed the decapitated head of the Draugr on the rear end of the corpse. And so I'm going to put a note on the screen here as I speak, and if you have to pause, of course, because it's another interesting detail in the film that demonstrates a close detail concerning Icelandic folklore about the Draugr and one of the ways to kill them. Well, now, moving on, while Amleth causes chaos at night and the characters still don't know that it is a human provoking all the macabre mayhem, these actions are seen as something supernatural that happens on the farm, namely in relation to popular Nordic beliefs, or particularly of Icelandic beliefs, of certain spirits outside the farms that could harm humans, such as Maras and the Disir. And in the film we then have the various characters who have been poisoned by the mushrooms and are hallucinating, screaming. They hear female laughter and voices, which I thought it was a really interesting touch of bringing elements of folklore into the scene. Amleth begins to kill recklessly, and after the revelation that Gundrun, the mother of the protagonist, had planned all the events that led to the development of the drama. Until then, Amleth, in his frustration and anger, kills Þórir, son of Fjolnir. Well, this obviously leads to Þórir's funeral, and if you watched my last video, which I hope you did, to avoid repetition and to avoid wasting time here, especially your time, We already know some details about this funeral scene and the boat-shaped motifs in funerary contexts of this cultural background. Well, in this scene from the film, we have a clear direct reference to the only direct witness of a Rus funeral. Rus, a term used to describe, among other things, the Scandinavians who navigated the rivers of Eastern Europe. The account of the Arab Hamed ibn Fadlan, that's what it is, who reports the first events in the years 921 or 922 of the Common Era, preserved in manuscripts from the 13th century onwards. These accounts of his diplomatic mission by the Abbasid Caliphate to finance, arm, and instruct in the Islamic faith the Slavs, represented by Hetler Hamas ibn Yalbar of the Volga. And these accounts are a primary and direct source on the customs of different peoples found on the Volga, nowadays Russia. I won't be here reporting all the details, but only what I think is relevant to understand this scene in the film, in the movie The Northman. So, according to Fadlan, he reports that when one of the leaders dies, he is burned. Fadlan is a witness to the death of an important man and has gone to his grave to see him. They had put him there with a roof over him for 10 days until they finished cutting and sewing his clothes. And an interesting detail about the funeral in relation to social discrepancy: when the deceased is a poor man, they build a small boat, put the corpse inside and burn it. That's it. When he is a rich man, they gather his money and divide it in 3/3, one for the family, one for making his clothes, and one for the wine on the day his slave girl kills herself or is killed and burned with her owner. Those present drink a lot of wine. They drink it day and night, and as Fadlan says, sometimes one of them dies with a mug in his hand. When one of their leaders dies, the family asks their male and female slaves, "Which of you will die with him?" To which one of them replies, "I do." If the person says so, agrees to it, is obliged to do so without being able to take it back. Even if the person wants to, can't. In most cases, those who qualify for this self-sacrifice are the slaves, of course. Regarding a rich man, a nobleman, king or chieftain, we have several details from Ibn Fadlan. After the slave says that she will die with her master, 2 slaves are appointed to watch over her, go with her wherever she goes, and even sometimes wash her feet with their own hands. The slave drank and sang happily and merrily all day long while they attended to the dead man's needs, such as cutting his clothes and making him new ones. On the day of burning them, the nobleman and the slave girl, Ibn Fadlan goes to the river where the boat of the man that is to be cremated in the funeral ritual was moored. They had taken the boat out of the water so that it could be fitted with 4 wooden pillars. They also placed around it what appeared to be a large wooden structure, like a barn. So the boat was pulled onto that structure. They approached, coming and going, the people coming and going, while the deceased still lay in the tomb. They brought a pallet, put it in the boat, and filled it with a Byzantine brocade mattress and pillows. There came an old woman whom they call Angel of Death, in charge of sewing and arranging the upholstery, that which will cover or be fixed to furniture, in this case where the dead man will be laid down. And this woman is also in charge of killing slaves, or sacrificing them, which is the same thing. Fadlan describes her as a huge and sinister sorceress who, in a way, reminds us of the giantess at Baldur's funeral in mythology, right? Although the giantess is a little explored element, unfortunately, in the mythology written by Snorre Sturluson in the 13th century, because clearly all kinds of ritual pagan themes he did not want to report, and we clearly see many gaps in what he wrote. But, sorry. But we could really be in the presence of the female element in charge of performing the funerary ritual part, which I think it's interesting. Well, moving on, as Ibn Fadlan describes, when they got to the dead man's grave or tomb, they removed the dirt that was on the wood and then the wood itself. They took him out with the clothes he was wearing when he died. His body had turned black because of the cold in that land, something we never see in Hollywood representations and other romanticisms, and the dead always look healthier and prettier than the living. In the tomb, they had placed wine, fruit, and a drum. They took it all away. They dressed him in sort of underpants, stockings, boots, a tunic, and a kaftan of brocade with gold buttons. A pointed cap of brocade and sable fur was placed on his head. They loaded him up and put him in the tent that was over the boat. They laid his body on the mattress and his head on the pillows, and placed wine and fruit and basil with him. They brought bread and meat and set it before him. They brought a dog, broke it in half, and threw it into the boat. So they brought out all their weapons as well and placed them beside him, beside the deceased man. They took 2 horses, made them run to exhaustion, cut them to pieces and with a sword, and threw their meat into the boat. So they brought 2 cows, they also cut them into pieces and threw them into the boat. Then they prepared a rooster and a hen, killed them and put them in with the deceased as well. Meanwhile, the slave who wanted to accompany her master came and went, entering each of the tents. The owner of the tent would have sex with her and say, "Tell your owner, I did this out of love for you." And now let us look into what Fadlan has to say about the Angel of Death, a title of one of the songs I've written and composed for one of my melodic death metal bands back in my late teens. And this is not a joke, actually. Fadlan tells us that on Friday, such a lovely day for death, when it was time for the afternoon prayers, they brought the slave to a structure they had set up that looked like a door frame. She rested her legs on the palms of the man's hands until she could see over that frame. She said a few words and they let her down. They lifted her up a second time and she did as she had done the first time. Then they put her down and up a third time, and she did as she had done the other 2 times. So they gave her the chicken. She tore off its head and threw it away. They took the chicken and threw it into the boat. Fadlan asked the interpreter about what she was doing. He said, the first time they picked her up, she said, "There I see my father and mother." Of the second, she said, "There I see all my dead relatives sitting." And of the third, "There I see my owner in paradise along with men and slaves, and paradise is good and green. He is calling me, so send me to him." They took her to the boat. She took off the 2 bracelets she was wearing and gave them to the woman called the Angel of Death, who is the one who kills the slave. She took off the 2 anklets she was wearing and gave them to the 2 slaves who had been in her service, who, as Ibn Fadlan tells us, are actually the daughters of the woman known as the Angel of Death. So they loaded her into the boat without putting her inside the tent. The men came with shields and wooden sticks and gave her a cup of wine, to which she sang and then drank. The interpreter told Fadlan she does this to say goodbye to her companions. Then another mug was handed to her, which she took, extending the chant, to which the old woman urged her to drink and enter the tent where its owner was, her owner was, sorry. She was quite drunk at the end, for she wanted to enter the tent, but she put her head between it and the boat. The old woman took her head, pushed it into the tent, and went in with her. The man began to bang their sticks on their shields so that the sound of screams would not be heard, which would frighten the other slaves, making them no longer want to die with their owners. Then 6 men entered the tent and all of them had sex with the female slave without exception, and then laid her down next to her owner, 2 holding her by her feet and 2 by her hands. The old woman, called the Angel of Death, placed a rope around her neck, crossing the 2 ends and passing them to 2 men to pull, and came with a broad-bladed dagger. She started to stick it between her ribs, here and there, and then pulled it out while the 2 men choked her with the rope until she was dead. Then the closest relative of the deceased man came, took a stick and threw it into the fire, walking backwards with his back to the boat and facing the people, with the torch in one hand and the other covering his anus, as he was naked, and lit the wood that had been distributed under the boat. After that, they laid the body of the female slave they had killed beside her owner. So people came with sticks and firewood. Each one had a stick, the end of which they had lit and which they threw at the wood. The fire cooked the wood, the boat, and then the tent, the man and the slave, and everything else that was there. At that, a frightening wind hit, the flames grew and the heat intensified. Next to Fadlan was one of the Rus whom Fadlan heard talking to the interpreter. Fadlan asked the interpreter what the Rus man had said. He says, "You Arabs are fools." And Fadlan asked, "Why is that?" Then the man answered, "You put the people you love and respect the most in the earth, while the worms and vermin eat them. We burn them with fire in an instant, so they enter paradise at once." Then he laughed too hard. Fadlan asked about that wind, and the man said, "The love of his Lord for him is so great that he sent the wind to carry him off in 1 hour." And as Fadlan points out, not an hour passed before the boat, the firewood, the female slave, and the deceased man had turned to ashes and dust. Then, at the place where they had taken the boat out of the river, they built something like a round hill and planted a large wooden post in the middle. They wrote on it the name of the man, the name of the king or the chieftain of the Rus, and then they went away. My apologies, sometimes I cannot understand my own writing or whatever written form is this. From Hamed Ibn Fadlan's description and looking at the funeral scenes that we see in the film, The Northman, we have a good perception of the historical elements that helped to develop this cinematic scene, and on the other hand, the very new elements that are woven into the film precisely to build a whole cinematographic scene, dynamic in the representation of the cinematographic work that has both historical elements and elements from the producers and writers themselves to convey to the public a mixture of feelings and cause a visual impact that follows the very structure, history, and narrative of the film, the movie, The Northman. As we can see in the film, in the scene right at the beginning of the funeral part, we observe a woman being raised on something. We don't know what it is at first, only her face appearing as she says, "I see my father and mother," being lowered. Then she is raised again saying, "I see my dead kindred." She's lowered again and raised a third time. She returns to speak, "I see my master in Freyr's hall. He calls me to him." So we have a slave, an enslaved woman who was being raised above a structure that resembles a door, the door frame. She is richly adorned with brooches, glass beads, pendants, and bracelets. And then there is silence as she begins to sing, and it is finally revealed that this is the moment of Þórir's funeral. As we saw her earlier, or as I have tried to describe from the words of Ibn Fadlan, here is a direct reference to the words of the slave girl from Ibn Fadlan's account, who volunteers for death, with some alterations, of course, in the movie, but we must remember that Ahmed Ibn Fadlan himself admits to using a translator who explains the words of the Rus to him. On the other hand, there are certain expressions like angel of death and paradise that may be his attempt to explain to the readers of this account, this testimony of his. Therefore, it is difficult to know which words were actually spoken in the original language of the Rus. This is an account from the eyes of the Arab traveler towards the sacredness of the other, an interaction between cultures with certainly different worldviews. And he does his best to translate what he sees, but certainly some elements will not be well understood in terms of the symbolic and sacred meanings, but which is still the best account we have of an event of this category. Well, in Fadlan's narrations, as in the film itself, she is also raised to the door frame and mentions her relatives, ancestors, and the dead who call her from paradise, a good and green place. This door is a liminal space, and there the slave girl, the enslaved woman, is seeing something mysterious, something that is hidden. But those who are to become dead or to join in death can see. She sees her acceptance in this place. We have a very symbolic element that is presented between the funeral space and the living attending the funeral and what is beyond the door, where the dead will walk or join or are waiting. Here, the paradise reported by Ibn Fadlan is represented in the movie as the field of the people or the field of the band, Folkevangr, a warrior afterlife presided over by the goddess Freyr, who collects for herself half of the dead brought by the Valkyries, Valkyriur, an appropriate place for the dead of noble birth. The choice of the screenwriters is curious, to mention Freyr's Hall, as it is mentioned as a space also suitable for women, as we can read in the saga of Egil Skallagrimsson, as well as a reference to the god Freyr, worshipped by Fjolnir and his family. There is a whole set of elements in the film here that relate to the cult of the Vanir, especially Freyr and Freyja, which is curious because really both shaped motifs in Scandinavian context point to a possible connection to the cult of the Vanir, something I have spoken here before, so I'm not going to elaborate on that once more. But it is also curious because in Fadlan's account, it is the funeral of a Swedish chieftain or king or a nobleman, and indeed the god Freyr has been, since before the introduction of the cult of Odin in the north, the god and the lord of the Swedes, the god of Swedish nobility up until the late Iron Age. So we have interesting connections here. Now, the Angel of Death here in the film is a priestess who inhabits the farm of Fjolnir and who is responsible for the spiritual and the religiosity or spiritual activities in general of the area, including at the temple of Freyr, since in the credits of the film the actress is mentioned as Ashildur of Githia, which can be translated as the term of Hufgithia. In Old Icelandic can be translated more or less as priestess, Huf in the sense of temple, a localized religious space in a farmstead, and Githia, the feminine form of Godi, and for lack of a better term, because in English priest and priestess really aren't the best terms. So these were people responsible for a religious structure and communal feasts. However, the primary sources point more to a secular political title from medieval Iceland. Now, interestingly, I think that the choice of the first name is not by chance, Ashildur, since another famous scene about a funeral within this cultural space is the funeral of the god Balder, a funeral boat, reported by Snorri Sturluson, who in turn followed the poem of the skald Hulf Hugason called Husdrápa, concerning this mythological scene, which I presented in the previous video about funerals in the Viking Age, and which I will put again here on the screen for you to see, who tells us precisely about a female element called the Hild of the mountains, the giantess, who comes to push the ship of the deceased god Baldur, which in Snorri's version is the giantess Hirokin, this being an element that is very likely a reference to the so-called angel of death, as the woman who makes the funeral preparations and the ritual of sacrifice, and the indication that she comes to push forward the ship. I think it is to be a metaphor, understood as a metaphor, or a poetic element, to really refer to the activity of this female element as the person who makes it possible for the deceased and those who are sacrificed with him to symbolically start their journey to the afterlife, because through the conduct of the ritual, all the sacred and symbolic parts are concluded, and only then it is possible to successfully conclude the process of the journey of the dead, precisely due to the magical religious conduct of this female element. It could be an hypothesis, of course. Well, continuing, the two bracelets appear with the slave, who does not remove them in the film, nor does the chicken appear here. There's neither the appearance of any funeral helpers nor indications of any sort of preparations. Ibn Fadlan gives us many elements about the funeral that are not included or were not included in the film, because in the narrative of the film it is not really important to give so much emphasis to the funeral of a secondary character, and certainly many of the real elements would possibly generate a lot of negative criticism from the part of the public, because in reality these situations were much more brutal and violent, as Ibn Fadlan describes, something unthinkable in today's society, and just as well. That's why the sacrifice of the slave is in the background, right? Not in focus. The mourning family wears white. The men accompany the chant by beating their shields. The woman is taken to a boat that is partially inserted inside a small mound. On the boat is the body of Þórir, richly dressed and in armor, lying on a bed with a pillow, several plants around him, his helmet at his side. A woman in white and with a dagger at her waist deposits his sword on top of the deceased after receiving the woman who sings on the boat. In this scene, it is possible to notice a statue that seems to be of Freyr due to its large phallus. And then we have a closer look at Þórir's corpse. His nose or nostrils have been sealed, his mouth as well, sealed in some way with what appears to be clay. Well, the clashing of the shields and the women singing perhaps do not fulfill the same function as in Ibn Fadlan's account, because it is not clear in the film whether the women's voices and chant are those of the slaves or the inhabitants of the farm. Anyway, the men beat their shields here, I think more in an attempt to keep up with the chanting and less to hide something from the other slaves, as Ibn Fadlan describes. The drinking horn is delivered by the priestess, who stabs the slave right there in front of everyone, for everyone to see. All references to sexual intercourse do not exist in the film, as well as the tents that could be different spaces with unique ritualistic meanings, as well as different animals sacrificed in Fadlan's account, the chicken, the rooster and hen, the dog and cows. The exception is the horse, of course, as we will deal with further ahead briefly. References to the drum, fruits and wine are more or less represented here, I think, perhaps by the presence of mistletoe, or what seems to be mistletoe around Þórir's body. Maybe more in reference to Baldur's funeral, the god Baldur, who has been killed by an arrow or a dart made of mistletoe. Although I must say, from my own experience as an archaeologist, and really, literally, my first work as an archaeologist a decade ago was a funerary context with about 2,000 years old. It was not uncommon to include various herbs, especially aromatics, in a cremation context, as it helps to minimize the smell of the cremation of a body. It will certainly have had a sacred and religious symbology, surely, but first, like everything else in life, there is a practical reason that then passes through a magical religious thought as a way of preserving certain customs and practices. The detail of the covered or sealed nose and mouth is interesting. This is the Nábjarðir ritual. It is the last performance to the dead, closing the nostrils, eyes, and mouth. This is a body that will be cremated and or buried, in this case of the movie, buried, just like in the most famous archaeological context, in a funerary context such as the Osberg ship and Gokstad ship burials, where there is a whole funeral preparation and everything is buried. We don't know for sure the reason for this final ritual, but maybe there was some kind of superstition or some belief, or even simply causing some emotional discomfort, the idea of burying someone and the earth and animals or other earth beings entering through the dead person's orifices, or even the fear that the body could come back to life possessed by a spirit or someone's magic. So maybe all the orifices would be closed to make it difficult for any kind of thing to enter the body and make it breathe again and return or walk again. Sagas and Icelandic folklore are filled with accounts of the figure of the Draugr, the restless dead, the restless undead, the white, right? After this, we have the scene of the slave drinking from the horn while the woman in white, the supposed priestess, partially recites stanza 76 of the poem Hávamál. They are frender, they are sjálfur il sama en hóstýr, they are elrigi, þeim herser góðan getur. There are several translations for this. I myself have made some translations into English, not literally translating it, but a translation to better match the poetic spirit of it. So my apologies if it doesn't sound as good as older translations, and here's one of them, if you please. The relatives die in the same way I myself will die. However, the renown will never die for those who obtain good fame. Then we have Fjolnir, who leans his head against that of a horse that has been prepared as if for riding, and announces the end of mourning for Þórir, his son, while handing a sword to his now only son, who announces the sacrifice of the horse with the following words. May the neck ale of this swift steed hasten you to the highest tree of the battle weavers, brother. Then he proceeds to sacrifice the animal with several strokes of the blade. In the background, the slave is hanged by a man or choked to death by a man while the woman in white stabs her several times between the ribs. I already spoke about the horse and its symbology in this cultural context, both in the previous video precisely about this film and in other videos, of course. So I will be brief so as not to repeat myself and to avoid being boring to you. However, the reference to the horse here is curious because they are animals present in different funeral rites, but there is a probable connection to the cult of the god Freyr, once again, since in a saga known as the Saga of Ravnkell, a priest of Freyr, precisely, Ravnkell's saga, Freysgårda, where a farmer has a unique connection with the horse named Freyfaxi, dedicated to the god Freyr, precisely. In the movie, young Gunnar's words about the blood that gushes from the stallion and the tallest tree of the battle weavers must be a reference both to the horse's role as a psychopomp, the animal that acts in the passage between worlds and carries persons or the dead into the afterlife, as well as a reference to the Norns mentioned throughout the film, quite a lot, as the weavers of fate, but possibly also a reference to the Valkyries. And, well, one appears in the film precisely riding a horse carrying Ableth into Valhall, as the Valkyries, the Valkyriur, in several poems are indeed the weavers of battle and the weavers of the fate of battle. They both weave battles and the outcomes of battles, and they also weave the fate of those who are to die in battle. In the film, the sacrificed horse has its head separated, the blood collected, and Gudrun sprinkles the blood on the husband and son who are naked, announcing that he is the new heir of the farm, as he is the only living son. Fjolnir declares the end of his personal mourning and also declares the moment of his revenge against Hamlet. Regarding the blood that Gudrun sprinkles on her husband and son, it is interesting because we actually have some accounts of this act or sort of practice, although they are in very late sources in medieval Icelandic literature, one from the 13th, 14th century and another in the 15th century. I already talked about this in the previous video, but with more detail in the video I made titled Religious Practice in Nordic Paganism, where I've talked about altars, temples, and descriptions of temples. These descriptions of temples and this act of sprinkling blood or shedding and then sprinkling blood are sources that are mostly based on Christian rituals and religious spaces. And there is a clear transfer of Christian ritual and religious knowledge carried into an imagination of what a pagan temple would be like. The authors of these accounts were not pagan themselves and were inserted in a society not only in terms of temporal space far removed from when pagan temples existed and were still used, but also in a society in which such pagan rituals and the pagan religiosity and sacrifices had already been prohibited a few hundred years before. Therefore, it is difficult to really know the reality of these specific rituals and spaces, especially this one of sprinkling blood, which may not be of pagan origins from Northern Europe, but rather derived from the Roman Christian religious context. But as I was saying, or wanted to say, curiously, the boat where the bodies of Þórir and the female enslaved woman, the enslaved woman, the female slave, are found, is not burned here as it is in Ibn Fadlan account, since half of it is on a mound already, so any reference to burning ritualistic procedures of the vessel is also not in the film. As there is no burning of the ship, Fjolnir's nudity is not represented in the same way as in the account where the closest relative of the deceased starts the fire while covering the anus. Not only does Fjolnir make no move to cover himself, he raises the noise around him with his rattle. This rattle, which appears in ritualistic scenes and at other times in the film, is indeed connected to the removal of evil spirits and to the cult of Freyr in the source Gesta Danorum. It is a series of iron links joined together and can be found among the archaeological remains of the Osberg funerary ship and also present in funerals with sacrificial deposits of horses, as I've mentioned in the previous video. So it is indeed a real thing, a real object. Even with the non-representation of some real events and rituals, which certainly the brutality and violence and perhaps even scenes that cause or could cause disgust would not be something that the public, the general public, would be prepared to see or could even handle. Even so, in my view, this film and this scene in particular, which in fact of all of the ritual scenes in the film, only one is directly based on historical sources, precisely the funeral. So I think it is one of the best representations of a description as rich as the one we have from Ibn Fadlan's account, which we also see in the film The 13th Warrior from 1999. And although I like that movie quite a lot, the funeral scene is not as well presented as in Ibn Fadlan's account or in the movie The Northman. Despite that film in those early parts being directly based on precisely Ibn Fadlan's account. Now, the Northman is certainly a hard move to like if people are not aware of the depth of these cultural factors and the religiosity of and belief systems of these contexts and time periods. But I think it is still a great movie, very well constructed and an outstanding attention to details. My dear friends, I hope you have enjoyed this video. I hope it was useful. Thank you so much for watching. See you on the next video. And as always, tack för idag. Thanks for today. Obrigado por hoje. Until we meet again, my dear friends.